Hi, I'm Stephen Rosenfield. I'm the director of the American Comedy Institute and the author of the book, Mastering Stand-Up. And I'm coming to you via Mr. Media.
I'm Bob Andelman, and this is a Mr. Media interview. You can see, hear, and read more than 1,200 of my previous celebrity interviews at mrmedia.com. That's mrmedia.com. Subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, Alexa Podcast, or Stitcher, and follow me on Twitter and Facebook. And if you like the show, and I certainly hope that you do, please tell the world with a 5-star review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. On today's show, I'll talk to Stephen Rosenfield, founder of the American Comedy Institute and author of a new book, Mastering Stand-Up, The Complete Guide to Becoming a Successful Comedian. Stick around. If you're not funny, if you've never been funny, if friends don't flock to hear you tell stories about your crazy life, I'm afraid today's guest, Stephen Rosenfield, probably can't help you. Sorry. On the other hand, if you're one of those rare men and women with natural gifts for hitting a punchline just right, for reading a crowd, large or small, or who can convert a life of small, precious moments into big laughs, then the author of Mastering Stand-Up, The Complete Guide to Becoming a Successful Comedian, might know a valuable thing or two that you will find useful. Rosenfield is the founding director of the American Comedy Institute, and his alumni are as diverse as Jim Gaffigan and Lena Dunham. I mean, talk about opposite ends of the spectrum, right? In his book, he writes about the different types of comedy and comedians and breaks down the techniques and behind-the-scenes details that can make or break a modern comedian. I'm not interested in jumping on stage myself, but I am fascinated by stand-ups and their careers. In that regard, I found Mastering Stand-Up to be compelling and rich in detail. Stephen Rosenfield, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you.
Okay, let's jump right in. A comedian, a hitman, and a comedy instructor walk into a bar. What happens next?
It's entirely up to you.
Oh, really? That's all I'm going to get? Okay. All right, let's try it again. So I was afraid when I opened this book, I mean, Mastering Stand-Up, those two words basically, that's a lot you're promising there. And frankly, I was afraid it might be pompous, it might be superficial, but honestly, it was anything but. Is it fair to say that you don't explain the joke so much as the joke telling?
I'm not sure that I really understand your question.
Oh.
Can you rephrase it?
Yeah, sure. You in the book, you talk about telling jokes, but it's not so much that you break down. And when we explain jokes, they're not that funny. Your role, I think, in the book is to explain how to tell the jokes, not necessarily why a joke is funny.
Well, I would say something a little different in that the book, because the writing is so important in stand-up comedy. It's interesting because there are a lot of people who don't even know that when they go to see a stand-up that they're actually doing material that they've been probably doing for a few years, and they're doing it, word for word. The writing is such an important part of being successful at this. What the book does is that it goes into the various structures of writing. So I deal more with it structurally. How do you build a joke? What are the requirements of club comedians in terms of things like laughs per minute, which is a factor. A really good comedian will get upwards of 4 laughs a minute. It's possible to get 10 laughs a minute. The laughs per minute ratio is important in club comedy. And the book goes into how do you structure your material so that you can meet that requirement. And it also goes into the the writing forms of stand-up as well. And as far as why something is funny, I don't know that anyone knows the answer to that question. I really don't. The thing is, something's funny when people laugh. Mm-hmm. That's how you know it's funny. And that could seem self-evident, but it's not, unfortunately. For a lot of new comics, it's not. They'll have material in their sets that don't get strong laughs consistently. So there's only one way to really know if something's funny, and that's to see if people laugh or not.
Are people, is the public generally surprised that most routines, most stand-ups, that material has been written and worked on and rewritten? I mean, some people think when they go to a comedy show, it's just someone's talking off the top of their head, right?
That's right, and that's a huge compliment to the stand-ups, because part of what you have to learn to do as a stand-up is you have to learn how to perform the same material night after night after night, and usually year after year, in a way that appears to be so spontaneous that people think you're just talking off the top of your head. That's the trick. Every sort of performing art form has its trick. And by that, I mean, you go see a great singer and you think, oh my God, how is it possible to have that kind of singing voice, or a dancer make moves on the stage that seem just not humanly possible? It's like gravity has been suspended. And the trick for comedians is people see them and they think, how could this person be so spontaneously funny? Mm-hmm. It's impossible. And they're right, it is impossible. But the people that succeed at this have learned to become really terrific actors.
I was just thinking, my wife and I years ago went to, I guess it's the theater at Madison Square Garden, and saw Louis C.K. open for Ricky Gervais. So, this is before we knew Louis C.K. very well. It was kind of our introduction to him in terms of that thing. And it was interesting because he went on first, he opened, and Louis would talk and seem very much like he was talking off the top of his head. But, having been to a lot of comedy, I knew that clearly he'd worked on these things a long time. Then when Ricky Gervais came out, it was just the opposite. It was clear he was making things up as he went. That was his thing at the time. He didn't feel that he needed to have a polished routine. And you could tell, you could really tell. So what I'm wondering is, who are some comics that you would think of today who give the impression that they haven't polished their routine like a diamond, but clearly they have, that's just part of who they are, is that presentation that way?
Everyone.
Oh, okay.
Everyone.
Yeah.
You can't do this. Here's the thing. If you went to the theater and you paid money and made the arrangements to see the show, and the people on stage were told, guys, just kind of go with the flow, read the house. We're not going to tell you any lines. You would be sorely disappointed. And you would be a stand-up has to consistently deliver a terrific show. And one of the things that all terrific shows have in common is they all have terrific writing in it. You can't leave that up. That can't be spur of the moment. It just can't be.
Okay. Let's go back a minute. How does a gentleman found something like the American Comedy Institute? What were you doing at the time, and what prompted it, and what has it become over the years?
Well, I really backed into this. My background is in the theater as a director and as a writer. And I lived in Manhattan, and in between projects, I would coach actors who would come to me because they had an important audition or they wanted to work on things before they got to the set. And in the 80s, there was this gigantic stand-up boom. It was incredible. Cable television was just really getting underway in a big way. And it was almost all stand-up. And, it was like, it was like A Wonderful Life at Christmas time. It's like whatever channel you went to, there'd be a stand-up. And the reason for it was that they couldn't find anything cheaper to produce because all you needed was a microphone and a guy standing in front of something. And as a result of that, for a while, a lot of clubs opened up all at once. And a lot of, for instance, a lot of bars would advertise that, Thursday night would be stand-up night at the bar. During that time, comedians started coming to me to get coaching. And when I started working with them, I realized that it wasn't only the delivery that needed working on, it was also the writing that needed working on. So I started writing with them together. And I think because my background is in the theater, I knew how to write in other people's voices. I could absorb the way someone spoke and help them write material that sounded like them and not like me. And I found myself loving it. The people that I was working with started doing better. And I just backed into it. And during that time, this is a personal thing for me. The theater that I had fallen in love with was a very popular art form. I fell in love with the musicals of the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s. Shows like Guys and Dolls and My Fair Lady, those kinds of shows. And during that time, the theater developed a kind of elitist frame of mind. Stephen Sondheim became the man, and he and the audience that he was writing for was not a popular audience. It was an elitist audience, and he wrote brilliantly for that audience. But I missed the popular. I missed the popular theater, and what I found going to the clubs is that I could hear stuff about what was happening now, and it would be really funny, and sometimes really edgy. I mean, Lenny Bruce, I think, is the first person I ever went to see do stand up.
In high school, right? You skipped the day of high school.
I was in high school, yeah. No, a couple of friends and I. Amazingly, he did a matinee because I remember somehow the idea of Lenny Bruce doing a matinee. You can't picture Lenny Bruce, awake to do a matinee somehow. But having entertainment about what's happening right now is not something that the theater is particularly good at. I mean, what it is good at, it's unbelievably great. That's not one of the things that it's good at. And number two, I felt myself more comfortable. I enjoyed the audience in the clubs. I vibed with them increasingly more than I was with the kind of theater experience.
And at what point do you decide to collect all this and put it in a book. And who, what level is the book aimed at in your mind?
Okay. I'll answer the second question first, and then you may need to remind me about the first question. It's aimed at a couple groups. One, it's aimed at people who want to do this, seriously want to do it, and for people who are already doing it. There have been a lot of kind of how-to books that are basically kind of manuals to help you get started. But I wanted to write a book that covered that, but also covered beyond that, all the way up to the top, because there are things that are important. You know, I've worked with people who've made that journey all the way to the top. And there are things that need to be learned beyond the time when you're learning the basics. So that's one audience. Mm-hmm. And the other audience is people who love to watch comedy. Mm. That's the other audience.
Yeah, I think I fall into that. I mean, it was interesting. You could have taken an easier route and just done what you did with some routines and thought, well, you know, here's how Louis C.K. delivered a joke, and here's where but I like the thing that I keep coming back to. You have quite a bit in there on Mom's Mabley, who I remember from the Mike Douglas show and Merv Griffin and things. And growing up, I had no idea. I mean, no idea that she was lesbian, for one thing. And I just was like, really? It was just something that dropped out of nowhere for me. It was just like, wow, that was really interesting. So, I mean, what I'm saying is there's an element of research to the book as well that goes beyond just, you know, punchlines and you know, get on stage and, you know, deal with the heckler. But there's more to it than that.
Well, the reason why I brought that up is that, well, first of all, Mom's Mabley was one of our really greatest comedians, and she can very often be overlooked. I would say she is the mother of edgy comedy. You know, Lenny Bruce was the father; she was the mother, for sure. And the reason why I brought up her orientation was to make the point that the persona that a comedian creates very often is pretty much a creation of their imagination and may have very little to do with who they are. And I brought it up because one of the things that she was very edgy about was, in her comedy, was that she really loved young men.
Right.
You know, there's that wonderful joke that she has where she says, you know, the only time you see me holding an old man is, you know, when I'm holding him for the police.
Right.
And the idea of this clearly older woman expressing sexual desire for young men was one of the things that set her apart. And my point in bringing up her sexual orientation was to make the point that as a comedian, you can create who you want to be behind that microphone. And maybe it's close to who you really are, and maybe it isn't. I mean, her persona was sort of a really horny, almost homeless street person.
Absolutely.
I mean, it looked like she didn't have teeth.
Yeah.
And in fact, she was incredibly smart. She was enormously successful, well educated, and openly a lesbian at a time when almost nobody else was open about it.
Well, open for the era. I mean, the era was such that no one would have ever discussed that she was a lesbian, which is why I was so surprised to read that, because it was just a time where that never came up. But I agree with what you're saying.
During that time, there weren't any. You know.
Right.
There were no homosexuals or lesbians. That's a very recent development.
It's a completely modern development. That's right. It never existed before.
No, it didn't.
And the Earth is only 5,000 years old. So,
if that.
Could a current middle act get as much from mastering stand up as maybe an open micer? Or You know,
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yes, they can. They're things, even headliners, interestingly. I would say that one of the things that I cover in the book are the 7 qualities that go into a really successful comedian's persona, who they are. And the last one is that they know the answer to this question: what's your story? What's your story? And there are comics who are headliners. They're not just middle acts. They're headliners who haven't figured that out yet. Mm. And they do very well. I mean, they do well on the circuit. They headline, and they can make a good deal of money, but they don't become the top because they haven't figured that out yet. Mm-hmm. Dangerfield. It's interesting with Rodney Dangerfield, because in the late 40s and the early 50s, he tried to make it as a stand-up, and he couldn't. And he had a family, so he had to get a job. He had to get a steady paycheck.
He was selling like aluminum siding or something, wasn't
right? He was, yeah. And then he came back, 15 years later or so. He came back into it, and he realized that what was missing was this persona that made it clear who he was. And so he addressed that with that line: I get no respect. That's who he was.
That's certainly who he became.
That's who he became. Yeah. And what I'm saying is that line, or Joan Rivers' line, and it doesn't have to be a line, but this, I think, clear, can we talk?
Right.
It really very quickly lets the audience know, who is this person on stage? What's their story? Woody Allen, just to put a little history around this, when Woody Allen started doing stand-up, virtually everyone doing stand-up was married. The men were all married, and the few women who were doing stand-up were also married. And very often they were husband and wife. It's like, George Burns and Gracie Allen, or Jack Benny and Mary Livingston. And all the sitcoms were about married people. It was all, Life with Father and Leave It to Beaver, and not Life with Father. Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. The Honeymooners, The Life of Riley. And then Woody Allen comes along, and not only is he not married, he is very bitterly divorced. Yeah. That story of his, that story of being perennially single in the city, was Woody Allen's story. Mm-hmm. And because of his success, he really changed everything. The sitcoms there were hardly any sitcoms about married people. It was Friends, and it was, and Seinfeld and so on. Mm-hmm. So you can create your story in a way where you can actually tell the audience who you are or what this is going to be. In other words, I get no respect, or can we talk? Or you communicate it clearly through your material.
I'm laughing to myself because as you were talking about Woody Allen and his act in the 60s, all I hear going through my head is, I shot a moose.
It's a great piece.
And folks, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go to YouTube, look up I Shot a Moose, Woody Allen. You'll thank me for it later. So I'm wondering, have you watched the Pete Holmes series on HBO, Crashing?
I haven't.
Oh, okay. I wanted to ask you about that. Pete Holmes is an established comedian now, but he's playing this character who all he wants in life is a young man. He wants to be a stand-up, and he goes through quite the thing. We should come back and talk about it another time. I think you'll find it interesting. Cool. So let me ask you about the two most famous people whose names pop up on your book that you've worked with, Lena Dunham and Jim Gaffigan. Just out of curiosity, and not to spend too much time on it, but where were each of them in their careers when you encountered them?
That's an interesting question. Lena was a sophomore in high school in Brooklyn. And Jim was executive at an advertising company in Manhattan.
Which is what he looks like.
Yeah, it's
right?
what he was doing. Yeah.
And
so that's. Go ahead.
And how did they come to you, and what kind of things did you work on with them?
Well, people find me, which is good because it keeps this roof over my head. And at the time in New York, there was a time when there was just me and one other guy doing this. And that was it. So if you wanted to get mentored and get training, very often people would come to me. And I think people, they had a good experience. So I think the word of mouth was good. So that's how that happened. And I started with them the same way I start with everyone, which is to teach them the fundamentals of writing comedy and the fundamentals of performing comedy and the process of developing persona, the process of developing who you are behind that microphone.
They're obviously, from what you described, they were at very different points. Lena's in high school, but she comes from an artsy family, right? So I could see how she might be a little ahead of her group in looking for that. And then Gaffigan obviously wanted out of what he was doing and is looking for ways out.
Well, he also knew what he wanted to do. Jim studied with me for, I think it was a little less than 2 years. I mean, he was there for a long time, and he knew he wanted to be a stand-up, and that's really important because you're making a mistake if you say to yourself, I'm going to give myself a year, or I'm going to give myself 2 years, or I'm going to give myself 3 years. It's not the way to approach this. You got to approach this as, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to get as good as I can get, and not look back. And that's what Jim definitely, he was going for it. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Well, and that's interesting. You definitely would enjoy going back and catching up on 2 seasons of Crashing with Pete Holmes, because
I'm going to watch
that's who he is. And I'm going to take a chance and ask you about another TV show that has a similar theme to it, very recent. It's Amazon. They have The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
Yes.
Have you seen that one?
Yes, I have.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you what advice you might offer to Midge Maisel about her career and her material, if you can. I hate to put you on the spot, but that's what I'm here to do.
I would have liked to advise the producers on the first episode, because in the first episode, she writes this material for her husband. It doesn't go well. They get ticked off at each other. She gets drunk and goes up, and she's hilariously funny.
And topless.
Which doesn't happen.
No.
Okay. So if I had been involved in that series, which I love, by the way, I think it's an enormous amount of fun. I love the whole world of New York during that period. I would have written it so that what she does is she does the material that she wrote for him. Only she gets big laughs with it and he doesn't.
Right.
That would have been, I think, a better way to get it started. I would hate to think that there are millions of people who are thinking, I know how to get started. I'm going to just get bombed and get up. And don't do that.
Well, of course, in fairness to them, what happens there, only talking about the first episode here, folks, there's 8 of them. But in the first episode, she finds out the hard way that he hasn't been using his own material.
Right.
Right. He's been doing Bob Newhart routines, and such was the era before the internet and cable TV that people just didn't really know it. So yeah, it's a great series.
I actually saw something like that, which I couldn't believe. It was at the Improv, the original Improv, which isn't there. It was the first comedy club in the country, and it's not there anymore. And this was obviously many years ago. And this young kind of Connecticut preppy looking fella gets up on stage and does word for word Woody Allen's, shtetl jokes, about life in the Jewish villages in Middle Europe. And I couldn't believe my ears. And I was so angry. I started heckling him, which I never did it before that, and I never did it since. But I couldn't bear that he was doing Woody Allen's material. So it happens.
Well, by the way, folks, good news. If you're ever on stage doing an act and you get heckled, you can turn to Mastering Stand-Up for how to deal with that too. It's a good section on crowd work. In the book, you talk about a lot of different comedians. We mentioned Moms Mabley. I wanted to ask you just for briefly to touch on a couple of names and just kind of the what the takeaway from them was. So let's start with the one that you start with, which is Mark Twain, who people don't necessarily think of as a stand-up, but clearly was one of the original stand-ups.
He was. And what I think a lot of people also don't realize is that's how he became famous. He wrote Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn after he had established himself as a star in that circuit where people would pay to hear interesting people speak. And so much of what has become, in my book, I list 5 or 6 jokes, and I challenge the audience to guess who wrote them, because they're all very, very contemporary, covering stuff that we still talk about. And it was Mark Twain. So much of what he did, really, he's kind of the D.W. Griffith maybe of stand-up comedy. And the other thing is, and this helps, by the way, he was a genius. There's just, he to write stand-up material that you could do now, and still be funny. That's an amazing accomplishment, because comedy sometimes can, the expiration date can be fairly short, particularly with stand-up, but not for him.
Well, I think the natural successor to Mark Twain took a few years was Will Rogers, right? I mean, same type of thing. A lot of his material definitely still hold up today.
I think Will Rogers, there was more of a kind of political, he kind of focused on sort of political events, but definitely, absolutely. There definitely relationship between those two.
I had the opportunity to listen to all of Bob Hope's radio shows. Right? There's an app for that, of course. It's called Vintage Radio, and I'd listened to every Jack Benny episode, and then I went and listened to every Bob Hope. And the thing that struck me was, now we those of us who even remember Bob Hope, it's like, oh, he was this doddering old man who was always lusting after young women. But to listen to his radio comedy of the 40s and early 50s, very smart stuff, very smartly written. It was right on the money, and because he had to write, or his writers, I guess, but a little both, had to write new stuff every week. He was very sharp, very topical, but I also found there were moments when he clearly had to improvise, and he was a lot smarter than I think he gets credit for this many years out.
Well, that's true. I mean, listen, if you're a superstar for 50 years, you should get some credit for that's not easy to do. He had writers. Everybody had writers then. To be a comedian, you needed writers. You couldn't do it. Everybody bought their acts. Everybody did. The Marx Brothers, Bob Hope, Jack Benny. I mean, that's the way it was. You found really good writers who were really good at writing material for you. So a lot of what may appear to be ad-libbing probably isn't.
Yeah, no, I see that. But at times where I think he did ad-lib, and he was always known as a pretty good ad-libber. It was just very funny. It was very, very smart stuff. You've mentioned, since we've been talking, Lenny Bruce, but I wanted to ask you about Lenny Bruce in context of The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Who would have ever thought to make Lenny Bruce a supporting character in a sitcom?
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Right?
Yeah.
Anything you want to add about Lenny as we move through the history of comedy here?
Yeah. There's like two phases of his work as a comedian. The first phase is the one that I would urge people to find. And as you said, it's great now with the internet. You can find everything. When he was really doing stand-up, where his stuff was tightly written and funny and edgy, and absolutely terrific and original. And then there was a second, the end part of his career. He had a terrible addiction problem. He was being arrested constantly, and he was breaking down. But he still got on stage, and very often, and those performances are available as well. He rambles on and on. He may come up with something funny after 5 minutes of talking about something else. And that's not the Lenny. That's not who he was when he became famous. He became famous because his stand-up was just extraordinary. It's the most, when I gypped school to see him, it was the most avant-garde experience I have ever had in my life, before or since. Because I'd seen guys, standing on a stage in front of a microphone. But I felt two things when I was watching him, and I have never felt it again. I felt afraid, and I was laughing at the same time. And that's, no one's ever done. It was frightening. He was talking about, he in terms of, addressing taboos. I had never seen anything like it before. It was a little scary, really. And he was hilarious about it. And there's something else that I would want to add about him, which is he wasn't addressing taboos to be edgy. That was not his goal. It is the goal of a lot of comedians now. They want to be edgy. So they're like, what can't I talk about? And that's what I'll talk about. He was addressing them because of a really powerful, passionate abhorrence with the hypocrisy that he saw going on in front of him in politics, in the church, in establishment places. It came out of a real, he was able to turn his fury into comedy. Which is an amazing, very, very hard to do that. Very hard to do that. He wasn't doing it for the sake of being edgy. He was doing it because he felt it had to be addressed, and comedy was the way he addressed it.
Last one, and if we can, I know it's going to be difficult, but if we can separate some of his personal behavior that's caused him a lot of problem lately with his stand-up act, sure, which is extraordinary, Louis C.K. Right. Edgy. Someone reading this book who is a fan of Louis C.K., it'd be very hard to become a Louis C.K. That's about as unique as I think you get. And again, I'm trying to separate personal behavior from the stage act. A guy who would talk about his kids being not just monsters, but he wanted to do all kinds of hideous things. He wanted,
But I want to make a distinction there.
Yeah.
He didn't portray his kids as being monsters. He portrayed his kids as being kids.
Well,
which is
right.
what made it. Which is why we could laugh at it.
Right.
Because if he portrayed his own children as monsters, people would hate him. I think what he did was that he portrayed them as being their own age, and their ages for kids. When, as a parent, you want to kill them in quotation marks. Of course, you don't want to,
right.
But it's not because they're monsters. The thing he does about playing board games, with his little daughter, who's like 6, and it's taking her forever. Just to play Candyland, it's driving him nuts.
Right.
Not because she's a monster, but because she's 6 and she needs to take that time.
And there's such a huge gulf between the way he talks about his kids and the way, say, Jim Gaffigan talks about his kids, right? I mean, it shows you that there's just such a difference of where you can go. And I enjoy both of them. But I'm just saying, that's part of the point of the book. It's wherever your persona is, wherever you find the funny, I guess.
Well, it's something, it's a point that I make in the book and to everybody that works for me. I say, okay, here are the subjects of stand-up. You ready? Got your pencil ready. Number 1, how you feel about your life, how you feel about your life now, the past, the future. Number 2 is how you feel about anything else that you're interested in. If you're interested in politics, or you're interested in pop culture, or you're interested in food. Okay, that's the end of the list. It's a short list.
It was a short list.
But if you look at another art form, if we look at painting, what can you paint? You can paint how you see what's outside. You can paint how you see what's inside. And you can paint how you see what's inside of you. End of list. So if there's such a short list, how can anyone be original? And the answer is the subject is you. You are the subject. And you got that with Gaffigan, with Jim and Louis C.K. They're both talking about the same thing, but it's completely different because their sensibilities are complete, and they're both original. It's like if you watched in the late night talk show guys at a time when it was kind of at its height, when you had Letterman, and you had Jon Stewart, and you had Colbert on the Colbert Show. You had Leno, you had Jimmy Kimmel, and they all talked about exactly the same thing every night. They all had the exact same subjects, but their take was what made them original, not the subjects.
Right. All right. So I've got one more thing I want to ask you about before we go.
Okay.
Stand-up comedy has always been a real been a lot of landmines out there for women in particular. And so, a lot of men comics have not given them any respect. There haven't been as many female comedians as male. I think that's changing a bit now. Tig Notaro, Sarah Silverman, Amy Schumer, a lot of people that have become brand names at it. What I'm wondering is, from the book, what can you recommend women, particularly, hone in on from the book that will help them master stand-up?
Women are as funny as men are. The fact that there are fewer women than there are men in this has nothing to do with the idea that women can't be as funny as men is absolute. I mean, it's just mind-bogglingly stupid. And what I would say is get started, get going, start where you are. Start. That's the important thing. Is start. If you're at school, you could do shows at school. If you're out of school, parties are a great place to do your stand-up. Wherever you are, there's a place to do it. And you should start, knowing that if you love to do this and you get good at it, you're going to have a career. And the second thing is to buy my book.
And that's where we will end it, folks. And you can find Mastering Stand-Up, the complete guide to becoming a successful comedian in great bookstores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price at mrmedia.com. That's mrmedia.com. If you're watching this on the main website, below the video, you will see a copy of the book. You can click on it right now, and you can download it as an ebook, or you can have it shipped to you, maybe by drone. Maybe you can get it in 30 minutes from Amazon. I don't know. They're pretty quick these days. But go ahead and get it there. Stephen, is there a website for you, for the book, for the Institute?
Yeah, there is. And it's really interesting. And I'll get to it quickly because I don't, here it is. I don't know what it is. Here it is.
That's not a good sign.
You can reach me. I've read it carefully.
Okay.
You can reach me at Stephen, Stephen, at StephenRosenfieldComedy.com.
Okay. So that's your email address, but what's the URL? Where can people find your website?
For that, they need to go to if they just do the search engine to American Comedy Institute, okay, they'll find it.
All right. And are you on Twitter, Facebook, any social media?
As we speak.
No, yes. As we speak, or yes, as we speak? Yes.
No, yes, as we speak.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, Stephen Rosenfield, it's a really fun book to read, even for somebody who does not want to go up on stage. And thank you so much for joining us today on Mr. Media.
My pleasure. Thank you. Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience full of people who are convinced they are a whole lot funnier than you, and especially you, in the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida.
Hi, this is Rich Scheidner. And if you've ever wondered what it was like to be a stand-up comedian in the 1980s, I'm going to do you a big favor. Instead of billions of dollars for a time machine, you can just spend $24.95 and buy my new book, Kicking Through the Ashes, My Life as a Stand-Up in the 1980s Comedy Boom. It will save you money and give you thrills. It will take you there. Go to my website, richscheidner.com, go to amazon.com, and buy this book.